Good evening. My name is Shin-Yi Pai, and I'm the Program Director at Town Hall. On behalf of the staff at Town Hall Seattle, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's talk with Ross Reynolds. Ross's talk, How Audio Technology Changed the World, is part of the Speakers Bureau program at Humanities Washington, a nonprofit organization dedicated to opening minds and bridging divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We're so glad to have you join us in person tonight. The presentation will run about 60 minutes, including Q&A. To submit your questions for the Q&A portion of the event, please enter meet.ps/Reynolds or scan the QR code right now on the screen with your smartphone. We'll drop this link in the chat and remind folks where to go when we get to Q&A. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we will try to get to as many as possible. You can help us by keeping your own question concise. For those who would like to view the program at home with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming events include a live performance introducing our new artist-in-residence, cellist Gretchen Yanover, and an in-building talk with author Neil Stevenson about his latest novel. Visit our website to join our email list and get the latest updates as more programs are added throughout the season. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. As part of our Arts and Culture series, this event is supported by For Culture, Arts Fund, City of Seattle Arts and Culture, and Washington State Arts Commission. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members who are joining us tonight. If you share in Town Hall's vision of a community energized and empowered by questions of politics, science, and culture, please consider supporting us by becoming a member. You'll find membership information on our website. Ross Reynolds is KUOW's executive producer for community engagement, before which he was program host for 16 years. His awards include the 2011 Public Radio News Director's first place in the call-in category for living in a white city. In 2015, he was named to the University of Washington Communication Alumni Hall of Fame. Please join me in welcoming Ross Reynolds to the forum stage.
But my favorite credit by far is that I am an honorary seafarer pirate. And you may call me Rotten Ross if you'd like to address me by that name. I'm just thrilled to be here at Town Hall, and thanks so much to Shin-Yi for allowing me to do this talk here. Over the years, actually since the first week of Town Hall, I've been on various stages interviewing people. But tonight I get a chance to talk about something that I'm passionate about, so it's a great privilege, and I'm so happy that you're here and online to hear about it and to talk about it. My entire adult life has been spent in public radio, so sound and sound transmission are very core to everything I've done. I've been in Seattle for 34 years. Before coming to Seattle, and I was at KBOO in Worcester, Massachusetts, in Portland, Oregon, and I started in radio in Worcester, Massachusetts. I've got a master's degree in digital media from the University of Washington, and I'm just fascinated by the power of sound. There was a great quote from Garrison Keillor once. He said, "All of television is contained in a small box, although with big screen TVs, it's a bigger box now, but it's all kind of within that framework." And he said, with audio, it's as big as your imagination. And we're going to talk a lot about that this evening. In 1963, radio people felt threatened by television. Radio was thought to be dying, and the comedian Stan Freberg made an advertisement for radio.
Too bad about radio.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, since television, you know, hardly anybody listens to radio anymore.
Oh, I wouldn't worry about that if I were you. There's a radio in use for every man, woman, and teenager in America.
Really? Gee, I'd hate to think of them all turning them on at once.
They do. Every morning.
Who listens to radio? That go where you go medium called radio.
Radio? Why should I advertise on radio? There's nothing to look at, no pictures.
Listen, you can do things on radio you couldn't possibly do on TV.
That'll be the day.
All right, watch this. Okay, people, and now when I give you the cue, I want the 700-foot mountain of whipped cream to roll into Lake Michigan, which has been drained and filled with hot chocolate. Then the Royal Canadian Air Force will fly overhead towing a 10-ton maraschino cherry, which will be dropped into the whipped cream to the cheering of 25,000 extras. All right, cue the mountain. Cue the Air Force. Cue the maraschino cherry. Okay, 25,000 cheering extras. Now, you want to try that on television?
Of course, today, television and the movies can easily do that. They could show Lake Michigan filled with a hot chocolate and a maraschino cherry. It would look very realistic. They could show the destruction of Los Angeles. They could also show Paris rolling over on itself, as they did in the film Inception. But sound taps into the imagination in ways that visual stimulus does not. Perhaps that's because as the media theorist Marshall McLuhan famously said, the medium is the message. By that he meant the way the message is received can be just as important as the content of the message itself. If you read the words, "she wept," that's very different than hearing the sound of a woman weeping. And that's very different from seeing a film of a woman weeping. Television, books, the internet, they're all different media. Each medium shapes us in different ways. McLuhan said, we shape our tools and then they shape us. So we create communications media, and then by using those media, they affect us. TV and the internet are what Marshall McLuhan would call hot media. That's to say that there's a lot of information there. There's a lot of information on your computer screen, and you're saturated with it. A hot medium saturates our senses. Audio is what McLuhan would call a cool medium. It provides just audio, and you have to fill in the pictures. All the visual information comes from your brains, and as I'll demonstrate, and I'm sure you've witnessed in your own lives, audio can be very evocative, can be very visual. We create the images from sound, and that's why books on tape can be so effective. You can create those images in your mind. Here's an example from the New York Times radio show and podcast, The Daily. Last year, they asked people to talk about the best thing that happened to them in the pandemic.
This is Chris from KUOW Arena, North Carolina. In 2017, me and my wife got married, and that following year, in spring of 2018, we started to try and...
Excuse me.
This is Chris from KUOW Arena, North Carolina. In 2017, me and my wife got married, and that following year, in spring of 2018, we started to try and have a baby. And there were quite a few roadblocks that we encountered, fertility specialists, so on. And this Monday, I came downstairs to head to work, and my wife was at the kitchen table with a positive pregnancy test. It's the world to me. It's honestly really made this year worth it. We are both so happy and so thrilled. We just can't wait to have a family.
Hi, this is Leslie Kretz, and I live in Milton, Ontario, Canada. And the best thing that happened to me this year was the birth of my son Nathan on February 10th. So he's 10 months old today.
My wife and I welcomed our first son this year.
We welcomed twins in February of this year.
I had a baby girl.
A baby boy.
We welcomed our first baby.
Our first child.
Isabel.
Lucy May.
Sophia.
Maeve. Lillian.
Enuma Elish.
We called him Goose for short.
Can you say anything?
Hey, this is Will from Western Massachusetts. I'm a doctor out here, and unfortunately we've had to quarantine from most people because of that. And things have been really difficult this year, like they have been for lots of people. But at one point, right when I was getting ready to go to work, about 6:30 p.m., I'm a nocturnist, and my wife's feeling frustrated and a little lonely, totally understandably. Our daughter, who's, I don't know how many months old at that point, but a little over a year, just decided to stand up and walk across the living room for the first time. And it was like this magical being from another universe just kind of like entered the house and became ambulatory. And we both started tearing up, kind of laughing hysterically. It was like this kind of tear in the fabric of our day-to-day life that was so welcome.
I've heard that piece of sound several dozen times, and it still kind of affects me emotionally, and maybe it did you also. So in this presentation, I want to talk about how transmitted audio from far away affects us. Imagine how magical it must have been to talk on the phone with someone for the first time. They were far away, yet they were right in your ear. And telephones show us the magic of audio. Phone calls have changed my life. I was in a phone booth looking out at the Atlantic Ocean when I found out I got a job in Portland, Oregon, and I was going to move here, and I've not returned to live there since then. There's phone calls from a doctor, there's phone calls from a family member. There's all kinds of phone calls that affect us deeply. My wife calls her brothers every week, and she says all they have to do is say a few words, and she instantly knows how they're feeling. She doesn't see them, she just hears what is in their voice, and there's so much in voices. As amazing as the phone was, it was still just one phone to another phone. You needed a wire to connect them. In 1920, mass media arrived. Behold, in all its glory, the mahogany Philco music radio cabinet and carved wood case. That forest scene in the middle, its needlepoint. In the early days, radios were a treasured piece of furniture everyone would gather around. This was the early 20th century version of a screening room with a 100-inch TV and surround sound. The first broadcast radio station went on the air in 1920. So what we see today is we're just after the first century of radio, and radio's changed a lot over those years. It was so new when it first came on the scene, they didn't have a word for what the radio did. Broadcasting was originally a term for spreading seeds in agriculture. Now it's for radio and television, spreading over the airwaves, carrying news and entertainment and live events. It's really difficult to imagine what an impact radio had on the world. It was a wonder. It sparked the imagination of everyone who encountered it. It was the first medium to connect masses of people across great geographic areas at once. Hearing those voices was magical. As many realized, the power to be able to reach a large audience was going to be who was going to figure out the way to use that, who was going to control it. It was like a gold rush. Eric Barnow, in The History of Broadcasting, wrote, the story of early radio is around statesmen, mountebanks, teachers, salesmen, artists, wheeler dealers, soldiers, saints, reporters, propagandists, and others. Who would control this powerful medium? People believed in the power of radio to create social change, in much the same way that when the internet first came along, people thought that would change the world, only in a positive way. We know better now. Politicians recognized the control of radio was a means of social control. In many countries, radio was all state-run. And if you were in a liberal democracy like Great Britain, you got the respected service, the BBC. In Nazi Germany, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels led the charge to create a radio cheap enough that even workers could own one. Most revolutions of the past century began first by seizing the radio station and later the television station. The massacre in Rwanda was instigated by radio broadcasts telling people to go out and kill their neighbors. Unlike in other countries, here in the US, private business controlled radio. Broadcasting became an advertising medium. It's really hard to imagine today because we see advertising all around us, but when radio first went on the air, they had not figured out that it could actually sell products, sell services, sell things. It took a while for businesses to realize that, and it also took a while for radio station owners to understand that they could sell commercials. At first, it was considered a bit too rude to run sort of an advertisement. They got over that quickly. But how do you get people to listen to radio? Well, you put on the radio the biggest stars of stage, screen, and music to pull in the audience. And when you've got their attention, you can sell ads and make a fortune. In its heyday, radio had the power of TV and the internet together. Radio is the mass medium, and as part of our Q&A, those of you who maybe have stories from listening to radio, I'd love to hear them. I've talked to people who can remember in Mexico, in Argentina rather, hearing the exaltation of Eva Perón, or people in other countries, these very formative first experiences of listening to radio, so I'd love you to share yours. Also, radio helped spread jazz and classical and country music across the country. Musicians like Artie Shaw, Marian Anderson, Hank Williams, and Charlie Parker, they were already known by their recordings, but radio brought them performing live right in your living room. You could be on 52nd Street and hear that music coming to you. Radio comedy and drama became the primary entertainment, spelling the beginning of the end for vaudeville. Orson Welles, who's seen here on the right, founded the Mercury Theater back in 1938. He played the Shadow, Lamont Cranston. And in 1938, they did a radio adaptation of The War of the Worlds. Some of you know this story. They wove fake news bulletins into a music program, and it was so convincing because no one had gotten the idea before of doing sort of a meta broadcast that was faking you out. People were afraid. There were deaths that took place, and it really changed people's view of the medium, realizing kind of the sinister aspects of what it could do. During World War II, radio took on a new role as a trusted news source. Edward R. Murrow a revered radio newsman. He became a national figure broadcasting from the London rooftops during the Blitz in World War II, vividly describing the searchlights scanning the sky for Nazi bombers. Murrow did a blistering expose of Senator Joe McCarthy that helped end the Red Scare. He attended college at what became Washington State University, and as some of you know, that now includes the Edward R. Murrow School of Communication. The arrival of television beginning in the 1950s changed radio. As you can hear in that Stan Freberg bit, at the beginning there was fear that television would wipe out radio. That didn't happen. Radio evolved. The big stars of the day did go from radio to TV, but radio created its own stars, the DJs, the talk show hosts. Radio stations played to the medium's strength, music formats, news, sports, and talk. And radio became hyper-local. That's why when you go through the Midwest, radio stations broadcast commodity prices and in-depth weather reports for farmers. In urban areas, traffic reports have become vital. Then in the 1960s, a new form of radio became available. Now, I could have played Steely Dan's FM here, but if you get the reference, it's already playing in your head. That's the power of sound. The new technology, of course, was FM radio, and the broadcast signal had a much higher quality than AM. But because few people had FM radios, commercial interests were very slow to adopt it. That meant that radio frequencies were readily available. Universities, like the University of Washington, and colleges, even high schools, grabbed up those frequencies. College stations broadcast a schedule of educational radio, professors lecturing, and classical music. In the 1960s, the cultural uprising around the newly empowered youth generation, the protests against the Vietnam War, the surge of rock and roll was the sound of what became known as underground radio, like this station from Boston. Also in the 1960s, there was this reawakening of interest back from the early days of radio, and no one knew what it could be, but this potential it would have to change and enlighten people, to help to lead the youth movement. And people were also began to consider how radio could do much more than entertain. It could be a public service. It could create and serve an informed public. In that spirit, in 1967, Lyndon Johnson in Congress created a funding mechanism for public media. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting funds public media. The original draft of the legislation funding public broadcasting was only for TV. And at the last minute, as you can see here, they crossed off on the original legislation the word television, and so that they could also be funding radio. Otherwise, radio, there would be no public radio if someone had made that change at the very last minute. National Public Radio was created in 1970. And by the way, NPR no longer stands for National Public Radio. It's just NPR because it's not a provider not only of radio, but also web streaming and podcasting content. The first broadcast from NPR was live coverage of the Senate on Foreign Relations hearings on Vietnam. And the first daily program was All Things Considered. It went on the air just over 50 years ago, April 20th, 1971. And this is from their first broadcast.
Thousands of young people came to Washington willing to risk being arrested in order to end the war. They went into the streets this morning to stop the government from functioning by clogging many Washington roads during this morning's rush hour. For many demonstrators, the mobile street tactics of civil disobedience are an expected spring event. But before today, many other young people who came to Washington had not been willing to oppose the state with their bodies. For these young Americans, today was a major test of their commitment to the ethical code of the young and the angry. It was their freedom ride, their Selma March, their May Day.
Stop the war now! 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 Stop the war now!
A line of young people has just come across the highway. Traffic is stopped. And here come the police. 1, 2, 3, 4 police on motor scooters. One demonstrator knocked down by a motor scooter policeman. Anger now. Anger of the young people.
Motor 3 on the Southwest Freeway. Have one injured down here. Could you send me an ambulance?
And he goes on to interview the police officer and asks, is this a technique where you run your motorcycle into the demonstrators? And he says, no, we couldn't. We had to hit them. It was, what are you going to do? You can't stop on a dime. And you heard in that little section of that piece sort of many of the traits which we now take as commonplace in public radio. The use of you are there, natural sound, using the sound to tell the story, create pictures in your imagination. And they were already there then. And since then, a lot of those techniques are what you'll hear in podcasts also, as people have evolved the craft and the art of audio. Now, the terrestrial radio relies on a radio tower. AM stations require not only a tower, but also lots of land around them, because the signal's actually broadcast to the ground and bounced up into the sky. That's just the way that AM works. You need a stick to broadcast. But in the 1990s, satellite radio from the upper atmosphere became available. The first satellite radio broadcasts were in Africa and the Middle East back around 1999, sparsely populated places where it's hard to place enough antennas to reach people. The first U.S. broadcasts were in 2001, dominated by Sirius satellite radio and XM satellite radio, and they later merged. The next innovation in audio transmission that dominates today is the internet, and that chapter actually begins right here in Seattle. That's Rob Glazer. He left his job at Microsoft to found Progressive Networks. Their goal was to provide a distribution channel for politically progressive content. But what caught on was not the politics, it was the distribution of audio via the internet, and this technology known as streaming, which really became popular. Glazer pivoted to streaming technology. He rebranded Progressive Networks as Real Networks, and the breakthrough technology was the real player. Suddenly the computer could talk. It was scratchy and it was glitchy, but the computer could speak. And as computers and connections got faster, the audio quality improved radically. One of the earliest internet-transmitted events was a baseball game between the New York Yankees and the Seattle Mariners on September 5th, 1995. Besides listening live, audio over internet technology allowed you to download an audio file and listen to it at your leisure. It was the audio equivalent of video cassette recorders, if anyone remembers those. You could record the show and watch it at convenient times. So suddenly with podcasts, listening was untethered from time, and the podcast was born. The first podcast, October 2003, a weekly Music Hope program hosted by Matt Schickler called The Backstage Pass, and he talked to the Beach Boys, B.B. King, Third Eye Blind. It was still clunky to download and listen to podcasts, but then in June 2005, Apple released iTunes 4.9, the first program that made it really easy to find and download podcasts, not just to your computer, but also to portable devices like the Apple iPod. And that's how podcasts got their name. It's a mashup of iPod and broadcast. In 2014, this podcast really brought podcasts to the masses.
This is a Global CalLink prepaid call from
Adnan Sayed,
an inmate at a Maryland Correctional Facility.
From This American Life and WBEZ Chicago, it's Serial, one story told week by week. I'm Sarah Koenig. For the last year, I've spent every working day trying to figure out where a high school kid was for an hour after school one day in 1999. Or if you want to get technical about it, and apparently I do, where a high school kid was for 21 minutes after school one day in 1999. This search sometimes feels undignified on my part. I've had to ask about teenagers' sex lives, where, how often, with whom, about notes they passed in class, about their drug habits, their relationships with their parents. And I am not a detective or a private investigator. I'm not even a crime reporter. But yet...
And she talks about how undignified it was for her to kind of follow the stories of sex among these teenagers. And it was such a compelling style that it really caught on. It became a huge success for podcasts. The first episode came out early October 2014. Within a month, Serial was the fastest podcast ever to reach 5 million downloads. In December of that year, it was downloaded 10 million times. And of course, the sound of Serial inspired lots of other true crime podcasts, which were parodied on the television show that's on Hulu now, Murders in the Building. It's not only become a thing, it's become a thing you can make fun of. But what was it about the sound of Serial and podcasting that attracts people? It was a new way to experience audio information, and it created a new listening experience. Rebecca Mead wrote in The New Yorker that the great podcasts presented an audio narrative that can be immersive in a way that a radio playing in the background rarely is. Podcasts are designed to take up time rather than be checked, scanned, or rushed through. If you're not familiar with podcasts, although I suspect many in this audience are, but you're not alone if you have not really gotten into them at all. 45% of Americans have never listened to a podcast. That number's dropping rapidly. There are 800 million people listening to podcasts today. By 2025, that number could be doubled to more than 2 billion. The number of podcasts is also increasing astronomically. As of December 2020, Apple hosted 1.68 million podcasts. And here are the most popular. You notice many from public radio, The Daily, This American Life, Radio Lab, Planet Money, Fresh Air. Ben Shapiro and David Benigno are conservative talk show hosts. And Daniel Ek, the boss of Spotify, the audio streaming service, said audio, not just music, will be the future. So Spotify started a podcast hosted by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. So one of the things I like to talk about with you is, if you're an avid podcast listener, what do you listen to and why do you find it attractive? So when we get to our Q&A section, I hope you'll have some stories to tell me and turn us all on to podcasts. Or if you have just questions about them, we could also talk about that. Podcasts are a boon to anyone who wants to reach a large audience directly. Instead of working for a radio show or working at a radio network, the internet allows you to connect to a potential worldwide audience. You can create something with a personal voice and talk about the stories that fascinate you. Joe Rogan and Mark Maron, who you might be familiar with, do long-form interviews. And as I mentioned, Serial has spawned dozens of true crime podcasts, including My Favorite Murder, in which two women dish for an hour on their favorite murder. For some people, podcasts have replaced radio listening. This is a concern to radio broadcasters, because there's a certain amount of time in the day, and time spent listening to something else is not being spent listening to public radio. That phone number is 206-543-9595. It's pretty easy to podcast if you know the basics of audio production. Microphone, a computer, high-speed internet connection, audio recorder, digital editing software, you're good to go. And in the realm of technology and mass media, that's a pretty simple way to go. The ease of podcasting and the increased number of users has led everyone and their sister to start a podcast. If you're a celebrity, the chances are you've been on podcasts or you have your own podcast. Anyone interested in anything, from bird calls to politics to anything at all, will find a podcast that appeals to them. Now, in 2014, I mentioned Serial came online for the first time, and that was also the year that Amazon launched a brand new type of device with audio and transmission that really radically changed the formula. Artificial intelligence had already been around. It reached the level where computers could understand speech. You may be converted at that point to telephones that had that little microphone icon. You could say, call Harriet. Instead of pressing the buttons, it would call Harriet. And in 2014, Amazon introduced the smart speaker. It responds to questions and commands with actions and answers. There are smart speakers from Amazon and Sonos, Apple, Google, and others. I've got one of them. It's that hockey puck-looking thing down the lower right-hand corner. It's called Alexa. Alexa, what is a smart speaker? Alexa, what's a smart speaker?
According to Wikipedia, a smart speaker is a type of loudspeaker and voice command device with an integrated virtual assistant that offers interactive actions and hands-free activation with the help of one hot word. Some smart speakers can also act as a smart device that utilizes Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other protocol standards to extend usage beyond audio playback, such as to control home automation devices.
Now, you can ask a smart speaker anything. Alexa, what's Humanities Washington?
Here's something I found on the web. According to humanities.org, Humanities Washington debuts a new magazine featuring stories from the humanities around the state.
So they know some things, but not all things. Alexa, what does Humanities Washington do?
Here's something I found on the web. According to Gori.com, the nonstop service provides access to parts of the East Coast and the South through one of United
Alexa
Speakerhops
off.
at Washington.
Technically, smart speakers are always hearing, but they're not listening. The makers say they're not listening to your conversations unless you use the wake-up word. And that gets them to begin to listen and process the information to use in some way. So how many people have smart speakers in the United States? Smart speaker use is growing rapidly. It quintupled in just the last 2 years. A marketing firm estimates about 18 million smart speakers were shipped in America in the fourth quarter of 2020 alone. But as you can see in that graph, 2/3 of Americans don't have a smart speaker. One reason is the concerns about privacy. Hey, Alexa, when do you listen?
The playlist 80s Easy Pop on Amazon Music.
Alexa, off.
By the way,
Not that smart. Alexa, off. But the real concern is privacy when it comes to these smart speakers. When are they listening is what we like to figure out. And Alexa, if she had understood the question or been able to respond correctly, would have said, oh, it listens a lot, but it doesn't really take into account anything unless you need to use it. It basically reassures you that there are not any problems with privacy. However, Americans are, despite the reassurances, you can see just in 1 year, the percentage of people who had moderately or very concerned about smart speaker privacy went up sharply. My wife is wary about when that little hockey puck is circling light. What's going on there? And there is reason for suspicion. In 2017, Google Home Mini saved recordings at times when the wake word, OK Google, wasn't used. In 2018, an Amazon Echo sent private audio recordings in a home to someone on the owner's contact list.
a few locations for views near you.
Shh. So imagine this. You're sitting at home talking to someone in your home, and a half hour later, a friend calls you up from the other coast and says, I just heard that conversation you had. That's what actually happened. And of course, it never could happen again, we were told, and it was kind of impossible for that to be repeated. But it certainly happened once. In 2019, Amazon admitted that thousands of its employees were listening into recordings made on smart speakers and transcribing what they heard. Not things that were cued, just things they heard. So it's this basic convenience, convenience versus privacy. Despite that, owners of smart speakers appear to be growing. Sales are steadily, rapidly rising. So one of the third kind of big issue around sound transmission I'd love to get you to talk about is your skepticism or optimism, your use of smart speakers, and how they kind of worked for you. I'd like to share with you this short reading list about some of the books that informed this talk, and if you're interested in any of this, they really would deserve some further reading. Eric Barnow's History of Early Radio that I read a little bit earlier is a colorful portrait of this unique moment in world and human history, the birth of mass media. And no one knew what it was, and how they came to decide what it was is a very interesting story. Marshall McLuhan's Theory of Media is heavy reading. Believe me, I did papers on this in college, and it's very difficult to plow through, but his thoughts are summarized in an entertaining graphic work. The medium is the massage. Brooke Gladstone, the host of On the Media, for my money, one of the best shows on public radio, takes a look at the history of news in that illustrated book. And Jill Abramson focuses on how news has changed because of changes in technology from newspapers to the web to social media. And it's all really fascinating. So this is the portion where I've laid out a bunch of ideas, and hopefully some of them have connected with you and you'll be able to add to them. I learned from doing a talk show for many years that people in the audience know much more than you and your so-called experts. And that's why calls from listeners were so great. So I'm really looking forward to having you share your thoughts on things. And I got a number of areas I'm curious about. You might have others. You might have questions about expanding on some of the things I've already spoken about. But I'd love to hear what radio stations you listen to and why. And when did you start listening to radio? Is what you listen to now different than what you listened to younger? As I mentioned, I'm also very interested in podcasts that you listen to or books on tape. We had a really interesting discussion at a previous session. A literature professor wondered about her students listening to books rather than reading books, and we got into a really interesting discussion of what are the differences between taking the information in both ways. Maybe that's something you'd like to add. And I'd like to hear about your experience with smart speakers. It's a whole new form of audio transmission and reception. It's two-way. They listen to you and you respond. And are you comfortable with talking to a machine and having an answer back? Are you comfortable with having your kids talk to a machine and answer back? How about your parents? So I'm really interested in hearing more from you about points that I missed that you'd like to bring up or areas you'd like me to expand upon. Of course, this is a very quick, rapid overview. There are a huge swath of areas that I've left out. And we have this QR code over here, which you can look at, take a shot of, and add your questions to what's going on. So Shin Yi is joining us, and she's got some questions that have come in already. Questions and comments. Go ahead.
Just to reminder, if you do want to submit a question, you can do it at meet.ps/Reynolds, the site that's listed there on that slide, or you can scan your QR code. We have 3 questions that have come in so far. Was there a specific moment that inspired you to get into radio?
Yeah, CBS Mystery Theater when I was a kid. When I was 10 years old, and partly it was because of that evocative nature of radio and that transporting thing. I mean, I grew up in the 60s, 50s, and 60s. It was a television culture. But I was hooked when I heard CBS Mystery Theater. The sound effects and the way they transported you was just so powerful and so evocative. Radio drama just grabbed me. That got me into it.
Did you find yourself ever drifting off into TV or any other art or medium? And if so, what kept you in radio and sound?
Just an accident. I like to say I've got a face for radio. I did a little television for KCTS. I did a talk show there for a while. It was a combination with the University of Washington. I've occasionally been a co-moderator for debates. But I don't know about you. I don't want to be someone whose picture is plastered on the side of a bus. So everywhere you go, they know who you are. I mean, it's embarrassing enough to have a voice that many people recognize, because when I'm sitting on the bus gossiping with someone, I have to realize, keep it down. Just, people know who you are when they hear your voice, which is a little bit scary. But it's a little more anonymous than television, and it's just a really powerful medium. I've had a lot of fun over the years playing with the medium and trying out different things that you can do in a radio format that's loose. One time we decided we wanted to get listeners to kind of combine photography with radio. So I was on between 12 and 1, so we did something called the 1234 Project. So at 1234 every day, I would say, take a picture of where you are, what you're doing, and send it to us. And there would be people working in crawl spaces in attics, putting in insulation. They would show their food that was going on. And there was just this playfulness of engaging the audience in that way. They would really play with you to do anything you wanted. So that was kind of what kept me in it.
What has been the most surprising thing that you've encountered on the job?
The most surprising thing? Well, I can think of a lot of things. I was interviewing, and I'll not have his name for you, but he was a military colonel who had written a book during the Vietnam War, and it had to do with his unconventional ways of running a military base. And he would allow prostitution there. He would allow the soldiers to smoke pot. Highly unusual in Vietnam for a military commander to do that. So he came to the radio station and came into the studio, and I interviewed him about most of these things. And I brought up these questions that were not only in the book, but were also in the press material that got mailed to me. And his face turned ashen, and he looked extremely angry, and he just said, "I'm going to punch you out." So I backed off, I left the room, and his publicist came in and hustled him away. That surprised me. That surprised me a great deal. By the way, along with any questions about the presentation, I've been working in public radio for a long time, so if you just have general questions about public radio, either here or in the world, I'd be happy to take a swing at them.
Has the radio industry been in danger with the rise of Alexa and smart speakers?
That's a great question, because it is in danger. I mean, not this week. Actually, things are going quite well at KUOW. We were one of the few stations to not have to lay off workers during COVID. WNYC in New York laid off about 10 people in their newsroom, which was kind of shocking. They've got one of the premier newsrooms in the country. But right now, the radio audience is shrinking. It's a little bit every year. It's getting smaller and smaller because people have other things that they can listen to and other things that they want to do. So it's a big challenge for people who are in public radio, what they're going to be doing in the not too distant future. Now at KUOW, some of you might know we have a couple of podcasts. The Wild, we have a daily news podcast. The Weekend, some of our radio shows are also podcasts. So we're trying to get our feet in that area. So there's a lot of ways that radio has to really work to compete. And there's been a lot of dry wells when it comes to that. One thing I didn't even mention at all was radio stations which could broadcast on their sub-frequencies. So if you bought one of these HD radios, you could not only listen to KUOW, you could listen to KUOW2 and KUOW3. It was a big thing at the radio station that gave us all these radios, completely fizzled out. I don't know if any stations anymore use their sub-frequencies for HD radio, and I don't know if maybe some of you have HD radios. I'd love to hear any stories you have about using HD radio. I thought it was kind of a brilliant idea, but the price of making content for 3 radio stations rather than 1 was just too much, and you couldn't convince people to get these newfangled radios, so it didn't really work out. But I'm very bullish on the future of radio, just looking to how it's changed up until now. I mean, it will find a way to reach people, and it's still, by far, the quickest and easiest way for audio to get to you when there's breaking news and events. During 9/11, et cetera. I mean, at previous talks where I've talked about impact of radio, people talk about the night John Lennon was shot and how they were listening to radio and how that brought that immediately home to them. Or for an older generation, hearing that John Kennedy had gotten shot, that was coming to you over the radio. People will go to their sources that are live and for you first when something big happens, or in an emergency, in a snowstorm, when something goes on. You want to turn into your local outlet and find out what's going on. And oftentimes it's radio, because if you're in the car, it's not that easy to watch television. So in the long run, I think radio will pull through, and I'll be fascinated to see how it changes in the future. Will it adopt some of the tactics of podcasts? Will it become more like podcasts in its style and the way that it delivers information? To be determined.
We have a few more questions. Keep them coming. If someone says they heard it on the radio versus read it on the internet, for some reason radio seems more credible. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Depends where you are on the internet. Depends where you are on the radio. These are value-neutral media, and so something can be completely wrong and false on the radio, or it could be completely true. And this is, of course, a problem that we're all encountering all the time now. It's like, how do you decide who to believe? And there are, as we know, widely varied ideas of what to believe. Some people believe this talk radio show host, some people believe this NPR show, and ne'er the twain shall meet. And that's kind of one of the casualties of our culture at the moment, is that we've gotten so many sources available to you, and I include podcasts in this category, that you can narrowcast in a very limited kind of discussion, and you can still reach a huge audience. It's financially viable to do that podcast about knitting. And then imagine all those different podcasts that are focusing on various political beliefs and deniers. It can go in any direction. So how do you figure out what's true, and how do you figure out which radio to listen to? Well, I always tell people, don't just listen to public radio. When people call up and say, I only listen to public radio, I'm a little bit nervous, because I think you should expose yourself to other sorts of information. And by hearing all of it, we've got this great idea in America about the marketplace of ideas, that we have public media and private media, so you can go into that marketplace and you can pick up all kinds of information and culture and arts from various places. And the ideal is that at the end of the day, we'll come to the right conclusions when it comes to voting or casting our ballots, that there'll be some kind of rationality and truth that kind of shines through because we're well informed. And that whole process is completely up in the air at the moment. I mean, there are surveys that show that when you believe something firmly, when it's one of your core beliefs, take one. Think of what's a core belief of yours, something that you believe in the bottom of your heart. If I were to present you with information, facts, data that contradicted that, you would not only think that my facts were wrong, you would also cling to your belief even more. And we see this in other people very frequently. We don't see it so much in ourselves, but it's universal. It's across the board.
So these next couple of questions are about radio voice. They seem kind of related. I'll give them both to you. Many years ago, there was an SNL skit with Dan Aykroyd as a radio announcer, switching from a speedy AM voice to a slow, mellow FM voice. Why is that representation correct in many different countries? And the other one related to that is, do you think the radio voice is important? Nowadays, anyone can start a podcast with their smartphone, but do you find it more captivating when their voice is unique in some specific way?
Yeah, radio voices are a really interesting phenomenon. When I started in radio in the 1970s, your FM announcer had a very particular way of giving a delivery, and and so that was very popular. And I think one of the great things that public radio has done is that people talk more naturally. They don't talk in such an affected way. Now, even just to put on the old FM radio accent summons up visions of what was different. And the surefire AM, really rapid talking delivery, that was another style. Because there are so many ways that you're getting information now from all kinds of radio stations and all kinds of podcasts, those voices have really expanded and gotten really much more varied and different. One thing we talk about a lot on KUOW is we'd like to serve the entire audience, but do the voices that we have on the air sometimes not reflect the entire audience? Do people who listen not hear voices that are familiar to them? Now, I don't think that's a deal killer. We don't have to have people who talk like us to believe them and to find their information useful. But there is a kernel of truth in that. And that's one challenge that public radio is also facing. Unlike a podcast, we're trying to serve a large audience. So how do we make people feel welcome by having many different styles of voices on the air? And believe me, when we've done this in the past, sometimes people call up and they don't like that voice because it sounds different to them. You get a real lesson in voice when you're a public radio program director, because people have such firm opinions about the voices that they hear, and they can't stand certain voices, and they love other voices. And sometimes I know what they're talking about, and sometimes it's just something, maybe it reminds you of something that happened when you were a kid, but it's got nothing to do with the voice itself. It's so widely varied. So the other question was about the radio voice being more credible, perhaps, than the podcast voice. I think it was along like the different qualities of the two of them.
Yeah.
But
right. Nowadays, anyone can start a podcast
Yeah.
with their smartphone. Do you find it more captivating when their voice is unique in some specific way?
Well, again, I mean, if there's a podcast and someone is speaking in a voice that of a particular accent, if you're from Louisiana and maybe you have a fond affection for Louisiana patois and you're listening to a voice that's speaking like that, I love listening to WWOZ from New Orleans. And partly the reason I love listening to it is that the people speak as though they're from New Orleans, and it's just, you feel like you're there a little bit. So, and other people would just be going, I really hate that accent. So it's as individual as each listener. And it's the problem sometimes with radio is that it has to broadly appeal. If you're doing a podcast of Cajun music, you only have to appeal to X number of people. But if you're trying to serve an entire audience like we are in Seattle, you have to kind of keep your eye on the ball and make sure that you're not too focused on a single type of thing, but you're providing a sort of a broad plate of various things for people to check out.
Local newspapers are apparently rapidly disappearing. How is local radio different?
Local radio is not doing that much better, but I can report that public radio is doing quite well. Notwithstanding the layoffs I mentioned at WNYC, public radio newsrooms are growing by leaps and bounds. And also, radio stations are beginning to realize that they can combine, get together, and work together. If you listen to KUOW or KNKX, you hear the Northwest News Network. And that is a network that I was a news director at the time, and news directors at Benton, KPLU, and Eastern Washington station, KWSU, got together and said, you know, we don't have anybody in Olympia. This kid, Tom Bonsi, he seems like a pretty sharp guy. He's been covering the State House in Minnesota. Let's hire him for the term to come in and do coverage of that. So the three of us news directors, just by using part of our freelance budget, were able to put on Tom Bonsi, and to our everlasting gratitude, he succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. And now we have Austin Jenkins, who kind of does the State House stuff, and Austin is more of a free floater. We get stories from Eastern Washington from our reporter there. And we were doing this quite a bit before other parts of the country were. Now you see grants that are being funded to encourage radio stations to figure out how to set up newsrooms and how to do those things together.
Just a couple more questions. How has advertising changed as radio has had to compete with commercial free?
How's advertising changed?
Yeah, on radio.
On radio?
Yeah.
I'll confess, I've been in public radio for my entire career, so I can just respond to that as a listener. I think advertising on commercial radio has become less tolerable as more outlets are there. I think they're facing a much more of a crisis than public radio is, because although we do have fundraising drives and although we do have underwriting announcements, businesses buying announcements on the air, it's still much less than you'll hear on commercial radio. So the fact that they got to sell those time spots all throughout the day, it really, I think, is driving listeners away in a certain sense. I mean, a compelling radio personality will keep them tuned over the commercial, but it's going to be tough just because there's more chaff and less wheat when you have to pack in all those radio ads. But I will say this, radio advertising also gets incredibly creative. I listen to some wonderful radio things that people in the commercial ad area are doing, and they're really terrific. They create little mini radio plays, and if you listen closely to them, the craft of great radio ads really is advancing it. They're listening to things like This American Life. They're listening to public radio and incorporating some of those tools, and then commercial radio has always had its own tools.
This audience member is a fan of the Tiny Desk series on NPR and notes that they've brought in a whole new younger generation, including artists from today, and wonders if you think this segment has helped radio's popularity.
Oh, certainly. It certainly broadened it. It becomes really tricky, though, as does music formats. When you play a certain kind of music, people will love it and other people will hate it, so you're dividing the audience. The famous situation in public broadcasting was opera. KUOW and many other public stations still broadcast opera. The thing about opera is that if you love opera, you love it a lot. Just about everybody else can't tolerate it. So you've got an opera show on Sunday afternoon at 4, and you can be sure most of your audience is going to tune out. Those opera lovers are going to love it. But as a radio, I was a program director, so it's a challenge for you. What are you going to do to get them back after this thing that pushed them away for 2 hours? And consequently, and this is unfortunate, it's kind of streamlined what the format of radio stations are. And I was a part of that. When I came to KUOW, and some of you who listened for a long time might remember this, we played classical and news, classical and NPR news programs. And in the mid-90s, as the program director, I began to think about that a lot because a lot of other news programs were becoming available from the BBC and from NPR. Talk of the Nation, a great talk show, was produced around then. And I began to think that as the steward of a radio station, your goal is to serve an audience as well as you possibly can. It's not necessarily to get the biggest audience, but to serve your audience well. And in a market like Seattle, where there's more than 30 radio stations, and King FM, then as now, was broadcasting classical 24 hours a day, I kind of came to the decision that we didn't need to do classical because King, as you might know, funded by the Bullitt family, has in its charter, it will always be there with classical music. So in some ways, it took the pressure off us to drop classical and bring in news and information. It was not an easy decision. We still had many people on staff who got hired as classical programmers. I had people writing me saying I was destroying Western civilization by taking classical music off the air, but it's proven to be a good strategy, and it's really, over the years, when I started in public radio, KUOW was like the 20th listened to radio station in the market. Today it's always number 1, 2, or 3. And I think that's because people like the fact they can tune in to thoughtful, in-depth news and information from public radio whenever they want to. So the singularity of programming is really important to do with radio stations. But I still miss the old days when I worked in community radio in Worcester, Massachusetts. Anything and everything went on the air. And also in Portland, Oregon. You just had the craziest mixture of things going on. I remember coming into KUOW in Portland one day, and there was some Vietnamese people in cowboy boots, and they were getting ready to do their poetry show, and you had the punks in back, and they were pulling their little 7 inches for their punk show that was going on, and you had the serious political people here, they were getting ready to do a politics show, and you had the disability people were meeting because they had a disability radio show, and that kind of wonderful mixture was just kind of great to see. Unfortunately, passion and group identity does not mean you're good at radio. So a lot of those shows were pretty much unlistenable, but it did get a chance for those voices to be on there and to represent themselves. But you give up that when you're thinking, I want to do maximum service to the audience, and so that's what we did.
So we just have 2 last questions, and one of these you answered a similar one related to the advertising. For radio, there is an advertisement effectiveness attribution problem in spite of what incentivizes advertisers to use radio compared to the internet, where they can get effectiveness stats. So it's not exactly phrased as a question, but I think it's asking about the effectiveness of advertisement on radio versus internet.
Sure, that's a good question, and we have a whole underwriting department that really focuses on that. We do have quite a bit of audience data, which we purchase, and those of you who have been in broadcasting realize this. We know quite a bit about our audience. We generally know their ages, we know where they live, we know what their average age is, we even know some of the products that they buy, which we use as just kind of background information. But if you're a commercial radio station, you can come in and say, you know, our audience buys Porsches like mad. You're going to have a really effective pitch to give to that Porsche dealership. So there is a lot of information you have about your audience which can be used to monetize that audience by selling that audience to the advertiser that wants to reach them. I've been noticing lately, and maybe you have too, there are so many tech products, internet products that are underwritten on KUOW. Sometimes it sounds like everybody who's doing underwriting announcements is appealing to those folks in South Lake Union who are searching for various high-tech products. So audiences for radio stations reflect back, and a lot of times the ads will give you some hint as to who the listeners are.
Okay. And your last question. With the beginning of radio, as you said earlier in your talk, it needed stars to bring in an audience. Is that necessary today? Movies and TV still cast the most popular actors to bring in fans. Is that still a thing for radio, or was that just during its inception or creation?
No, I don't think when television came along, Jack Benny didn't want to do a radio show anymore. He wanted to do a TV show, of course, because it was much more powerful. It could reach a larger audience. But that's not to say that you've kind of seen that go in reverse. I was mentioning earlier that every famous person is either on a podcast or has a podcast. So all of a sudden they're coming back to audio in podcast form because for the same reasons that everyone else is. They can talk about their particular artistic vision. They can talk about what they're interested in. And if they click with the audience, they've not only reaching that audience, but it's also can be a very lucrative career path for folks who want to just talk directly to folks. And it's because that podcast might not work on KUOW or on Cairo, but it works for that audience. And in a way, it's a golden age now for people who want to listen to audio. There's so much available out there, and it's expanding every day, much more than you could ever get to. So check it out.
Thank you, Ross and Humanities Washington, for such a wonderful talk.
Thank you, Shin. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out in person, and to everybody for watching at home. We hope you have a safe night. Thanks for coming in.
And stay in touch. I've got my email address up here if you've got other questions or comments or want to connect. I'd love to talk to you. I'm sorry.